Hi everyone, welcome to the Krafty Librarian. So it's been way too long between videos and that's my fault. I've been meaning to do a video on my concerns with open access, specifically institutional affiliation, since that's where the money is coming from. But I needed to take my time on this because I didn't want to sound like Chicken Little and that the sky was falling, that open access and institutional agreements are all bad. On the contrary, I think they have some definite benefits, but that doesn't erase my concerns. So without further ado, let's get chatting. For years, librarians have complained about information access. Researchers couldn't read some articles, librarians couldn't afford some subscriptions, and the public couldn't access taxpayer-funded research. Open access was supposed to address some of these problems, and in many ways it did. But I think open access created a different challenge, and not a challenge about reading in articles, but a challenge about paying for them, specifically paying to publish. Because open access transformed institutional affiliation from a piece of descriptive metadata into the financial eligibility criteria. An author's affiliation no longer just simply tells us where they work or where the research was conducted. It now can determine whether thousands of dollars in article processing charges, also known as APCs, are paid by an institution to the publisher. Recent discussions from the Committee on Publication Ethics, the International Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers Researcher Identity Group, and commentators in the Scholarly Kitchen all point to the same concern. Researcher identity and institutional affiliation verification requires increased scrutiny. And why is that? That is because anyone who has ever tried to track institutional publication output knows exactly what I mean, that data is messy. The institutional affiliation data is not standardized. My institution has been tracking institutional author output since the 1990s, and for more than 30 years, I have seen everything. I have seen authors use departments instead of institutions as their affiliation. I have seen hospitals instead of universities, universities listed instead of hospitals. I have seen abbreviations. I have seen authors use legacy institution names. I have seen authors use multiple variants and different ways of referring to the same one organization. I've seen an author use not 4, not 5, but 6 affiliations for themselves on the same paper. And I've even seen authors use home addresses as their institutional affiliations. Libraries have spent decades trying to normalize this information for bibliometrics, rankings, and publication reporting. And historically, there's always been problems. Publication counts are sometimes wrong. Institutional metrics aren't quite exactly as accurate as we'd like to see them. And there has always been a financial connection to this in the past. The aggregate data is often used of publication data is often used to influence rankings and grant competitiveness and funding opportunities. It directly impacts also institutional reputation. But what has changed is the distance between the affiliation and the money. In the past, it would be your group of publication data was linked to the information and the money. Now it is a single paper that can influence money and determine whether thousands of dollars in APC funding are going to be spent. Open access agreements use the author affiliation to determine the APC eligibility, and it's the corresponding author. A corresponding author's affiliation can now directly influence whether publishing costs are covered. And when that institutional information is poorly defined, and yet it's attached to money, people expect and require clear expectations, rules, guidelines, standards, because the affiliation now is directly connected to money. And what makes this even more concerning is the Committee on Publication Ethics recently opened a topic discussion called Claiming Institutional Affiliations. Topic discussions are intended to bring members of the scholarly publishing community together to explore publishing ethical issues. Let's think about that. They're discussing institutional affiliation and as an ethics in publishing. And the reason is the Center on Publishing Ethics, the Committee on Publishing Ethics notes that the standards for institutional affiliation remain unclear. Authors increasingly report multiple affiliations, and journals rarely provide consistent guideline and guidance regarding what constitutes a legitimate affiliation. And that's important. The problem is not that the publisher using the affiliation. The problem is not that the corresponding authors are using the affiliation. The problem is that the money that is now attached to that concept remains surprisingly poorly defined. If affiliation determines a financial eligibility, the publishing community needs a much clearer and much more consistent definition of what affiliation actually means. Because now, the corresponding author, who used to be the person who answered the emails regarding the article after they had shepherded through the publishing process, they are now the one who determines whether thousands of dollars of institutional money can go towards open access, whether the article qualifies for the APCs available under the institutional agreements. So think about that. A role that was originally designated for manuscript communication now acts as a gateway to institutional publishing funds, and as a result, getting the article even published in that journal. And the problem isn't that, like I said, the problem isn't that publishers are using the corresponding author. That's a reasonable determination. The problem is the corresponding authorship intersects with institutional money. And once money enters into the conversation, verification standards must evolve as well. And so I've lived with messy affiliations for decades. What has me concerned is seeing affiliation errors appear inside the APC dashboards in the eligibility workflows that these publishers have set up. And I'm not talking about spelling variation. I'm not talking about, was it a hospital versus university or university versus hospital? Those happen, and those are at least explainable. I mean examples where institutional relationships are not readily or easily verifiable. And this is where we have an uncomfortable distinction, because it is important to know an author claiming an affiliation is not the same thing as the institution verifying the affiliation. They are completely different activities. A recent BMJ Open article on institutional affiliation misrepresentation noted that ORCID data is largely self-reported and may not always be complete, current, or accurate. And I'm telling you, that isn't a surprise to this librarian. I can't tell you how many times I have seen an author of ours have incorrect ORCID data that reflects from their prior or 2 prior or 3 prior institutions. They don't update it, and their verification is relying solely on self-reported information. That's not an attack on ORCID. ORCID helps solve an important problem to identify authors and researchers, but it doesn't necessarily verify the current institutional eligibility for APC funding. It was never designed for that. Author identification and institutional affiliation are totally different problems, and we need to stop trying to fit the round ORCID plug into the square affiliation hole. So how are we actually verifying eligibility? That's a question that has caused me really to create this entire video. I am skeptical of the fully automated eligibility systems that publishers create. Many publisher workflows allow the author to use a personal email address, not necessarily institutional email address, and to self-select their institutions. Now, this can create an error. Most authors simply are just trying to submit the article and process things. However, like I said, mistakes can happen. Authors may select the wrong institution. They may the publisher may use an old affiliation. They may misunderstand which institution qualifies under the agreement. And some authors simply choose any institution they believe will provide or they can get APC funding from. And what concerns me is that these errors are not always identified before the request reaches the institution and the library. I have reviewed APC approval requests involving personal Gmail accounts from authors paired with institutional affiliation that appeared to be inconsistent with the author's stated organization. And that is scary from a financial standpoint and from a reputational standpoint. For example, I recently encountered an author who used a fictitious institution involving parts of our institution's name and their Gmail, and that was accepted by the publisher and the affiliation registry, and the article progressed through the publisher's workflow for me to then later verify. So it caused me to question, how meaningful is the publisher's verification even in the first place before it comes to us? If my library, if I had not been manually reviewing the request from that specific publisher, that APC charge could have been potentially auto-approved by that publisher when that author was not a part of our institution, had selected either accidentally or other reasons a fictitious institution to get it through for APCs. They say that libraries are supposed to be the secondary verification step. That's what the publishers are telling us. We are the backup. But the problem is we're not the secondary verification step. We are acting as the first and only really meaningful eligibility of review. We are the only ones who are basically saying, hey, publishers, this is not even close to my author. What's going on? And the other problem that we layer on top of this is academic medicine adds another feature of complexity to it. So for example, a physician may simultaneously be employed by a hospital, appointed at a medical school, and affiliated with a research institute. So that has multiple affiliations and institutional affiliations associated with it and can be difficult to track down. Likewise, residents and fellows move on advancing their careers. Students graduate and become employees elsewhere, while manuscripts often take a year or more to move from submission to publication. So a legitimate affiliation at the time of submission may be different by the time it is publication. That corresponding author is no longer affiliated with that institution. And the result is that the affiliation verification becomes more than just a technical challenge. It becomes a policy challenge. Just like there are no definitions on institutional affiliation, there are no definitions and standards about the time frame an author can claim institutional affiliation once they have departed. And I'm not talking about the issue related to a resident who graduated a few months ago and is publishing research that was completed while they were at that institution. Most people would consider that reasonable use of institutional affiliation. The problem is that the affiliation can drift from recent association to a historic association. I have personally encountered requests from authors who have left 5 years ago. And just this last week, I encountered somebody who had not been employed or been a student at the institution for over 11 years. At what point does I once worked here stop becoming the same as I'm affiliated here? Is it 2 months, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 11 years? The uncomfortable reality is that our industry has no consistent answer. And so this is starting to become and look like a research integrity problem also. The conversation is increasingly moving beyond APC workflows. It's becoming a problem with research integrity. STM's Researcher and Identity Group argues that scholarly publishing has invested heavily in verifying scholarly content while paying comparatively less attention to verifying researcher identity. And while I'm not saying that's a problem, the scholarly content thing, they should be heavily invested in it. They need to start strengthening their researcher identity. Historically, publishers have operated and worried on the content and whether what the authors are saying is true or verifiable. Now we have an issue as to whether the author is who they say they are, whether they are a part of a paper mill, whether they fraudulent author profiles, and whether they are coming from institutions or are they simply just trying to find some APC dollars. And this is getting to be more and more problematic. Retraction Watch recently highlighted similar concerns, noticing that unverifiable researchers are often considered warning signs for paper mill activities and other integrity risks. In other words, the question isn't simply who should pay the APC, but the question increasingly becomes how confident are we that the person who is who they are and claim to be and can be affiliated where they claim to be. And are they really affiliated? And if they are getting sketchy with their affiliation, how sketchy are they with their research? And that all brings up the other problem. We got AI coming onto the scene. AI, well, I say coming onto the scene, AI is on the scene. And this is an anti-AI video. It's a scaling argument. AI lowers the effort required to generate manuscripts and submission-ready content. More content means more submissions. More submissions means more pressure on an already stressed verification system. Weak identity controls do not become stronger when the volume increases. And I alluded to it a little bit earlier in this video about integrity and reputation and the institution. Publishers often treat affiliation as metadata, but institutions cannot afford to. For institutions, affiliation is also reputation. Remember when I said if an author is sketchy with their affiliation, it raises the question as to whether they are sketchy with their research? Recent guideline document developed by Flemish universities specifically warns that misuse of researcher institutional identities and affiliations create a reputational risk for institutions and undermines the trust in scholarly communications. And they're right. When an institutional name appears on a publication, the institution inherits at least some of the public responsibility for the work. Rightly or wrongly, most headlines typically do not say an individual may have inaccurately represented their affiliation. The headline says, researchers from institution X, and institution names carry the reputational consequences, which means affiliation verifications isn't just about APC payments, it's also about trust. So open access built the payment system that relies upon institutional affiliations before it built the guardrails. And I'm not arguing that open access is bad. I support open access. I'm not arguing that most authors are dishonest. I don't believe there are. I'm asking a governance question. Librarians have known for decades that institutional affiliation data is messy. Transformative agreements, APC funds, institutional publishing programs, and automated eligibility workflows now move billions of dollars through scholarly publication. Yet the industry still struggles to answer the basic questions. What constitutes a legitimate institutional affiliation? Who is responsible for verifying that affiliation? And what evidence should be required? What level of verification is sufficient before institutional funds are committed? The good news is that this is not an unsolvable problem. Publishers, institutions, funders, and identifier systems and standards organizations can work together to develop clearer standards for affiliation and stronger verification procedures. Institutions need to assert affiliation mechanisms where the institution itself serves as the source of truth for affiliation relationship. And there needs to be more transparent accountability through the workflow. But none of that would eliminate every error, and that's important to know. But it would acknowledge something that librarians have understood for decades. Affiliation data was never designed to be a financial control system, and yet that's exactly where we are right now. Open access built the payment system before it built the guardrails. Publishers have already demonstrated that they already know how to solve the difficult problem of authentication when revenue depends on it. Librarians and publishers have spent years of building federated authentication systems and identity providers, proxy servers, and single sign-on platforms designed to ensure that only authorized users gain access to subscription content. Why did they do that? Because there is money attached to the access. Today, billions of dollars in APC funding depend on verifying who the author is, where they are affiliated, and whether they qualify for the institutional support. Yet many of the editorial systems that publishers rely on heavily relies on this self-reported information of affiliation and personal email addresses, and workflows that ultimately depend on institutional review as the final safeguard, librarians reviewing as the final safeguard. And that imbalance should make us all uncomfortable. Because when billions of dollars and reputation depend on getting it right, trust me, I'm affiliated is no longer a verification standard. So I hope you all have enjoyed my little discussion about my concerns with institutional affiliation and its ties to APCs. Like I said, I don't see a problem with that as a concept. My problem is nobody is policing it, and they've done a very poor job of standardizing institutional affiliations. And until they actually come up with guardrails and standards about what is an institutional affiliation, who is affiliated, for how long, we are going to have billions of dollars as a slush fund to going back and forth, and possible serious consequences with institutional reputation when it comes to articles that have published under questionable affiliation. So there you have it. If you disagree with me, if you want to add on to this, feel free to comment. Hopefully I'll be able to have more videos sooner rather than later, but I look forward to talking with you in the future. And please hit that like button and subscribe. That helps me keep going and going further. And any ideas for future content, just hit me up. See you later.